Ronald Reagan was our nation's 40th president. Much has been written about him, but not until now is there a definitive biography of the man and the president. Max Boot is a historian, policy analyst, and the columnist for The Washington Post. His newest book, Reagan, His Life and Legend. And Max joins us now. Max, good to see you. Congratulations, 731 pages. I've read them. And it's interesting that you start this book at the end of Reagan's life, surrounded by his wife, two of his kids, Patty and Ron Jr. But what's interesting is you start at the point of Reagan, the legend, taking over, but your definitive biography suggests his legend isn't quite what we thought it was.
Yeah, no, it was a fascinating journey for me as a historian and biographer to spend the last decade looking at Reagan's life and discovering the real story beneath the legend. And I think the big thing I discovered was that he was in many ways both more ideological and more pragmatic than I think most people realize. And on the ideological front, he moved very far from his days as a New Deal Democrat, which he was when he was growing up in Illinois in the 1930s, and to his time as a very conservative Republican by the 1960s. And he often moved so far to the right that he was even accusing the Democratic Party of taking America down the road towards communism, repeating a lot of far-right tropes. And so there was a lot of concern about what would happen once he became governor of California and then president of the United States. But in both jobs, he really showed that he was the ultimate pragmatist. And as governor of California, he signed one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country and one of the toughest gun control bills. And in both Sacramento and Washington, he cut deals with Democrats. In 1986, he signed a law that legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. So he was actually the ultimate pragmatist and deal maker, not the ideologue that many expected him to be in office.
And as we know, very friendly with Tip O'Neill, the head of the other party, was with him. You wrote this book. I know it took you 10 years to write it. We get this book decades after his death. Why do we need what is a definitive biography today? How is history going to look back on Reagan?
Well, I think history will look back on Reagan as a great president, although a flawed president. And I think when I set out a decade ago to write this book, I thought that there were, a lot of books about Reagan, including some good books, but there was no really definitive biography. And that's what I really set out to write, something that looked at him with historical distance and objectivity. And my goal was to write neither a hagiography nor a hit job, but something that presented him with both his strengths and his weaknesses, his achievements, as well as his shortcomings. And so I was very gratified to see the New Yorker say that Reagan, His Life and Legend, aims to be the definitive biography, and it succeeds. That was kind of my mission accomplished moment.
Yeah. Now, Max, you are talking to Chicagoland, so I have to ask you a Chicago-based question because everybody knows that Reagan was born in Dixon and he lived here, but some may not know that it was Dutch Reagan who was the voice of the Cubs, and that actually led to his Hollywood career. Briefly talk about that.
Yeah, that was in the 30s when he was a sportscaster in Des Moines, and he was heard all over the Midwest, became known, as you said, as the voice of the Cubs. And he followed the Cubs out to spring training in Catalina Island off the coast of California. And while they were out there, he snuck away to get a screen test at the Warner Brothers studio. And lo and behold, Warner Brothers offered him a contract. And so he was then on his way from the Midwest to his new home in California with an opportunity to become a movie star. It's kind of a storybook adventure, but it's what really happened to him and what took him from celebrity in the Midwest to being more of a worldwide celebrity.
As you know, a lot of people think of Reagan as the conservatives' conservative. That's kind of the image of him. But the truth be told, that by reading your book, you do talk about issues like immigration, the amnesty bill. Reagan, would he be accepted as a Republican today?
That's a great question. I suspect a lot of MAGA Republicans would write him off as a rhino, as a Republican in name only, because he was somebody who was pro-free trade, pro-immigration, pro-NATO, pro-standing up to Russia. And he had this very sunny, optimistic view of America as a shining city on a hill. And he basically never denigrated Democrats, certainly never engaged in name-calling. He was somebody who believed in bipartisanship and deal-making, reaching across the aisle. And so, in 1984, he actually won 49 out of 50 states. He was not bent on sharpening his differences with the other party, but he was bent on actually widening his coalition. And so I think that that made him a great contrast to the kind of Republicans that you see in power today.
One of the classic examples when we talk about Reagan, the pragmatist, I mean, anybody who loves Reagan says, but this is the guy who looked at Gorbachev and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The truth is, you make it clear in the book, he wasn't the igniter of what happened there. He just understood the pragmatic nature of the day.
Yeah, I mean, Reagan certainly played a vital role in ending the Cold War, but it's often misunderstood. There's kind of this mythology around him that he bankrupted the Soviet Union and forced it into collapse. In fact, what really happened was he worked with Gorbachev after Gorbachev came to power in 1985 because he recognized that Gorbachev was a different kind of communist leader, somebody he could actually do business with. And he bonded with Gorbachev when they first met at their Geneva summit in 1985. And thereafter, they established a great relationship and were able in 1987 to sign the first treaty abolishing an entire class of nuclear weapons. So Reagan did have a very successful policy with the Soviet Union, but what was really successful was his policy not of confrontation, but his policy of cooperation with Gorbachev, which certainly ran counter to a lifetime of Reagan being this the hardline anti-communist. And here he was ending his career working constructively with the world's #1 communist.
I want you to get a chance to just talk about it's a social and medical issue of AIDS. He took tremendous criticism over how he handled the AIDS crisis. I interviewed his daughter, Patty, about her new book, Dear Mom and Dad, and she said, look, he was not homophobic, he was not anti-gay, he just didn't understand it. And she writes that at one point, he sat down with the doctors of the White House and said, explain this to me. Do we misunderstand Reagan on that issue?
Well, I think this was one of his big failures as president. Oddly enough, it was not something he was often criticized for in the 1980s. Democrats were not going after him on AIDS. They were going after him on the budget deficit. But in hindsight, it does seem like an appalling failure that tens of thousands of Americans were dying of this horrible disease. And he didn't even talk about it until 1987, didn't really provide presidential leadership. There was some action in his administration led largely by the Surgeon General, C. Everett Koop, and by Anthony Fauci, who even then was the director of the National Institutes of Health. But Reagan was not providing the kind of leadership he should have done. And you can argue about whether that was because he was homophobic or just didn't get it. I think it was a combination of things. But for whatever reason, that was certainly one of his biggest failures as president.
Max Boot, congratulations. It really is a definitive biography. There is now one. And there's a book event this Saturday at the Chicago Humanities Festival. You can hear Max. For more information, check out maxboot.net. Thank you, sir. Congratulations. We'll be right back.
Thanks for having me.